When the millionaire met the new housemaid, he was paralyzed at the sight of the necklace she was wearing. It was the same one his daughter wore when she disappeared years ago. Ronald Anderson, one of the most powerful businessmen in Mexico, watched as his life crumbled in a matter of seconds. The young woman who had just entered the mansion, with her timid posture and eyes full of inexplicable sadness, wore around her neck the symbol he had tried for years to erase from his memory, the necklace that his beloved daughter Emma had been wearing the day she disappeared. The silence took over the vast hall of the Anderson mansion. The sunlight filtered through the glass window, casting long shadows on the polished marble floor, but all of this went unnoticed by Ronald, whose gaze was fixed on the delicate necklace hanging from young Helen's neck. His mind was instantly transported back to a past he had struggled to forget, to that tragic day when his little Emma disappeared without a trace, taking with her the joy and peace of his life. Helen, on the other hand, felt the weight of her employer's gaze on her but dared not lift her eyes to meet his. Since being taken in by the orphanage, she had learned to keep her head down and not draw attention to herself. Her only valuable possession was that necklace, an item she had carried with her since childhood, never knowing where it came from or who it had belonged to before her. "You're Helen, right?" Ronald's voice broke the silence, but it sounded distant, as if he was still struggling to believe what he was seeing. "Yes, sir," she responded in a near whisper, her voice trembling slightly. Helen felt like this was her last safe place, a fresh start far from the hardships she had faced on the streets. But something about that first encounter filled her with a wave of uncertainty. Ronald, the mansion's butler, observed everything with meticulous attention. He was the keeper of silence in the mansion, aware of the secrets hidden within its halls and walls. Noticing Ronald's sudden disarray, he quickly intervened with a firm, controlled voice. "Mr. Anderson, is there anything else before I show Helen around the house?" Ronald blinked, as if waking from a dream, and slowly nodded his head. "No, Ronald, no. Just take her and explain her duties," he replied in a muted tone. With a discreet gesture, Ronald indicated for Helen to follow him. She cast one last glance at Ronald before disappearing down the mansion's corridors, accompanied by the butler. Ronald remained motionless for a moment, his thoughts still fixed on that necklace, which for him was more than just an accessory, it was an open wound, a painful reminder of what he had lost. As she walked through the corridors, Helen felt small and insignificant inside that grand place. The walls were adorned with luxurious paintings, and the furniture, all of dark, richly carved wood, spoke of a life she could never have imagined. Helen's heart raced, not only because of her fear of failure but also due to a strange sensation she couldn't explain, as if this place somehow felt familiar. Ronald led her to the kitchen, where the other maids were busy with their tasks. He formally introduced her, never taking his eyes off her, as if waiting for something. "This is Helen, the new maid. She will be responsible for maintaining the rooms and the garden. I expect you all to follow her example," he said, his voice heavy with authority, leaving no room for argument. But while Ronald spoke, his mind was elsewhere, already enveloped in shadows of suspicion. He had seen the look in Ronald's eyes and knew what that necklace represented. Ronald knew more than Helen could ever imagine, and her arrival threatened to unearth secrets he had sworn to keep buried. As Helen began her new life in the Anderson mansion, far from her humble and painful origins, Ronald knew he would not be able to rest until he discovered the truth about the young woman, and more importantly, the truth about the necklace she wore. If there was a chance that Emma was still alive, he needed to find out, and Ronald also understood what was at stake. Helen's presence was a threat he could not ignore. His eyes followed the new maid, every step she took was a possible trigger for the disaster he feared. The sun had just started to rise, tinting the sky orange and pink as Helen was already up, ready to start another day at the Anderson mansion. The routine there was rigid, with precise schedules and demands that tested her physical and emotional endurance. But Helen faced it all with determination. Every task was an opportunity to prove her worth, to show that despite her humble origins, she was capable of doing her job well. Helen quickly discovered that Ronald, the mansion's butler, would be one of her greatest challenges. From the first day, he was relentless, supervising her every move with a critical gaze. Ronald was an austere-looking man, always impeccably dressed, and his face rarely broke into a smile. "Helen, I was here earlier and found dust accumulating in the corner of the living room. You haven't been careful enough," he said one day with a cold, cutting voice. "Sorry, Mr. Ronald," Helen responded submissively, hurrying to correct the mistake, but inside, she felt her frustration grow. No matter how hard she tried, it seemed like it was never enough to please the butler. Still, she wouldn't let that discourage her. Her whole life had been a series of obstacles and challenges, and she had learned to face adversity with perseverance and patience. Ronald, for his part, watched Helen with a mixture of disapproval and suspicion. There was something about the young woman that unsettled him deeply, something beyond just her competence at work. Her presence was a threat to the tranquility of the mansion, and he knew Ronald was also being affected by it. He needed to find a way to neutralize that threat before it was too late. Amid that constant tension, Helen found solace in the mansion's garden. There, among the flowers and plants she cared for so lovingly, she allowed herself a moment of peace. The garden was vast, with stone paths winding between colorful flower beds and a large fountain in the center where the water fell softly, creating a relaxing melody. Helen spent hours tending to the plants, pulling weeds, watering flowers, and pruning the trees. For her, it was pleasurable work, almost therapeutic. One day, as she cared for the roses, Helen was interrupted by Isabel, one of the mansion's older maids. Isabel was an older woman with gray hair and wise eyes, who had worked in the house for many years. "Helen, dear, you truly have a special gift with plants," Isabel said, approaching with a warm smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Isabel," Helen replied, smiling back. Isabel was one of the few people in the mansion who treated Helen with kindness, and she greatly valued their friendship. "I see how hard you work, my dear," Isabel continued, looking at Helen with concern, "but don't let Mr. Ronald pressure you too much. He can be rigid, but that doesn't mean you're not doing a good job." Helen sighed, feeling the weight of Isabel's words. "I try my best, but it seems like it's never enough for him." Isabel gave Helen a comforting pat on the shoulder. "Ronald has always been like that, a perfectionist. But you're young, you have much ahead of you. Don't let him discourage you." Helen smiled, feeling a little more relieved. "Thank you, Mrs. Isabel. Your words give me strength to keep going." Isabel's support was a blessing for Helen, but at the same time, Helen knew she would have to find her own strength to face the daily challenges. And that included not just Ronald's criticisms, but also the strange feeling that something else was happening in the mansion, something she still couldn't fully understand. Days later, during a morning of work in the garden, Helen was once again surprised by Ronald, who appeared silently behind her while she was tending a row of tulips. "Good morning, Helen," he said, his tone soft but with a certain weight in his words. Helen quickly stood up, turning toward him with a mix of surprise and nervousness. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she replied, wiping her hands on her apron, feeling her heart beat faster. Ronald slowly approached, his eyes fixed on the flowers, but clearly with his mind elsewhere. "I see you have a special fondness for the garden," he commented, almost as if speaking to himself. "Yes, sir. I really like taking care of the plants. They bring me peace," Helen said, trying to find the right words to express how much the work meant to her. He nodded but soon diverted his gaze to the necklace hanging around Helen's neck, the same one that had captured his attention from the very first day. "That necklace seems very important to you," he said, his voice low and laden with an emotion Helen couldn't identify. Helen instinctively held the necklace, as if she wanted to protect it. "It's the only thing I have from my childhood, sir. I don't know how I got it, but I've always felt it was special." Ronald was silent for a moment, battling the avalanche of feelings that overwhelmed him. The necklace Helen wore was identical to the one his daughter Emma had worn the day she disappeared. But he knew he couldn't let emotions cloud his judgment. He needed answers. He needed to understand who this young woman was and how she came to possess that necklace. "Helen, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask me," he finally said, forcing a smile before turning and leaving the garden. Helen watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and unease. Ronald was kind to her, but there was something in his eyes, something she still didn't fully understand. Why was he so interested in her necklace? And why, since starting work there, did she feel a constant sense that something was about to happen, something big, and maybe even terrifying? As Ronald walked back into the mansion, his mind raced. He needed answers, and he knew he couldn't wait any longer. The necklace was a clue, a missing link in the mystery of his daughter's disappearance. With a heavy heart, he decided it was time to act. He would hire a detective to investigate Helen, discover her origins, and perhaps, finally, find out the truth that had tormented him for so long. Ronald, who had watched the interaction from a distance, clenched his fists, tension evident in his eyes. He knew Ronald wouldn't let this go, and that meant the past he had tried so hard to bury was about to resurface, threatening everything he had built. Meanwhile, Helen returned to her work in the garden, trying to ignore the growing unease inside her. She didn't know what the future held, but she was determined to keep doing her best no matter what. The garden would continue to be her refuge, the place where she found the strength to face the daily challenges in the Anderson mansion. But deep down, she knew something was changing, something she still couldn't understand. Dusk began to envelop the Anderson mansion in shadows when Ronald entered his office, closing the heavy mahogany door behind him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional ticking of the grandfather clock that dominated one of the walls. The thick curtains were partially drawn, allowing only a strip of golden light to illuminate the room, reflecting off the polished wood surface of his desk. Ronald sat in the leather chair, feeling the weight of the past few hours. Since the encounter in the garden, his mind had been working non-stop, recalling the details of Helen's necklace, the same one his daughter Emma had worn on the day she disappeared. He ran his hands over his face, trying to shake off the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare from which he could not wake up. How could it be? How could something so specific and unique reappear years later around the neck of an unknown young woman? He couldn't ignore it. He needed answers. Reaching for the phone on his desk, he quickly dialed a number he had memorized years ago but rarely used. The voice on the other end of the line answered with a mix of formality and familiarity. "Hello, Mr. Anderson. Richard here." Richard was a private detective with an impeccable reputation for solving difficult cases. He and Ronald had worked together on a few occasions in the past, always with discretion and effective results. "Richard, I need you to come to my house immediately. I have a delicate matter to discuss." "Of course, Mr. Anderson. I'll be there in an hour," Richard responded without hesitation. As he waited for the detective's arrival, Ronald stood and walked to the window, looking out over the vast garden now shrouded in twilight. His mind drifted back to the past, to that terrible day when Emma disappeared. She was just a little girl, her smile brightening any room she entered, and that necklace, a family gift he had given her on her 6th birthday, seemed to glow around her neck as a symbol of love and protection. But all of that had been ripped away in the blink of an eye, leaving a void he had never managed to fill. Now, that same necklace was back, but how? And why? The mansion's doorbell rang precisely an hour later. Richard arrived, dressed in a dark suit with the grave expression that accompanied him on all his jobs. He was a man of medium height, his gray hair neatly cut, and eyes that seemed to catch every detail around him. Ronald led him to Ronald's office, and as he opened the door, Richard immediately sensed the tension in the air. "Mr. Anderson," Richard greeted, extending his hand, which Ronald quickly shook. "Richard, thank you for coming so quickly," Ronald said, motioning for the detective to sit in the chair across from his desk. "I have something very serious to discuss, something that might be related to my daughter Emma's disappearance." The mention of Emma's name made Richard straighten in his seat. He remembered the case well, though he had never been directly involved in the investigation. The disappearance of the powerful Ronald Anderson's daughter had been one of the biggest mysteries that had shaken the Mexican elite years ago. Ronald took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. A few days ago, I hired a new maid, a young woman named Helen. She's wearing a necklace, an identical necklace to the one Emma wore the day she disappeared. Richard remained silent for a moment, processing the information. An identical necklace? That's quite unusual. Are you sure it's the same one? I'm sure, Ronald replied firmly. It's a unique piece, custom-made for Emma. There can't be two like it. The detective nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Have you investigated anything about Helen yet? No. It all happened so fast. I didn't want to raise any suspicions before being sure of what I was dealing with. That's why I called you, Ronald explained, his eyes reflecting a mix of hope and fear. Richard leaned forward slightly, his mind already formulating a plan of action. We need to find out everything about Helen, where she was born, who her parents are, and most importantly, how she came to possess that necklace. I'll need full access to her documents, any information you have. You'll have everything you need, Ronald assured. I just want the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Richard made a brief note in his notebook and then looked directly at Ronald. If Helen is somehow connected to Emma's disappearance, this could mean there are bigger things at play than we imagined. I'll be honest with you, Ronald. This investigation might uncover things that have been buried for a long time. I know, Ronald said, his voice heavy with emotion. But I'm prepared. I never stopped looking for Emma, and now, with this new lead, I need to know. With a nod, Richard stood, determined to begin the investigation immediately. Leave it to me. I'll need a few days to gather information. I'll contact you as soon as I have something concrete. Ronald walked the detective to the door, watching as he left the mansion. When he returned to his office, he felt the weight of responsibility fall on his shoulders. He knew he had made the right decision, but that didn't make the coming weeks any less agonizing. Every second of waiting would be torture, but there was nothing more he could do than trust that Richard would uncover the truth. Meanwhile, Helen continued her routine in the mansion, unaware of what was happening behind the scenes. However, she couldn't help but notice the subtle changes in Ronald's behavior. He seemed more distant, thoughtful, and she wondered if she had done something wrong. Ronald, on the other hand, maintained his severe demeanor, but Helen began to notice something strange in his gaze, as if he were more vigilant, more attentive to her every step. Days later, Richard returned to the Anderson mansion, this time with a more somber expression. Ronald immediately received him, anxious for news. Richard, what have you discovered? Ronald asked. Mr. Anderson, Richard began, sitting once again in the chair across from the desk. The investigation revealed some interesting things. Helen was found in a park 17 years ago when she was still a baby. She had been abandoned, and the only item she had with her was the necklace. She was taken to an orphanage, where she grew up without ever being adopted. Her origin is a mystery, but the necklace is the only connection we have. Ronald's heart raced. Then there's a possibility that Helen is Emma? Richard hesitated before answering. We can't confirm that with certainty yet. We need a concrete test, and that can only be done with a DNA test. But all the evidence points to something significant. Ronald stood up, beginning to pace back and forth. A DNA test, yes. We need to do it as soon as possible. But how can I convince Helen to take the test without raising suspicions? That's something we'll need to handle carefully, Richard said. Any rash move could make her feel threatened or distrustful. I suggest you approach her, gain her trust, and then propose the test as a health precaution or something along those lines. Ronald nodded, knowing he had to act delicately. But time was his enemy, and the idea that Helen could actually be his lost daughter had him on the edge of impatience. I'll do it, he said, his voice resolute. I'll approach her, talk to her, and when the time is right, suggest the test. Richard stood up, handing Ronald a folder containing the documents he had gathered. "Here's everything I found on Helen. Use it wisely, Mr. Anderson. I'll be at your disposal if you need anything else." "Thank you, Richard. I don't know what I would do without your help," Ronald said, shaking the detective's hand firmly. When Richard left, Ronald remained in his office, staring at the folder in his hands. Inside were the answers he had been seeking for years, but they terrified him. If Helen turned out to be Emma, it meant that all the suffering, all the pain that he and his wife Teresa had endured, could finally come to an end. But if she wasn't, he would have to face a new wave of disappointment and despair. Meanwhile, Helen continued with her routine at the mansion, unaware that her life was about to change drastically. The young woman, who had found a kind of peace in the mansion's garden, began to feel the weight of uncertainty about her own identity. And Ronald, noticing Ronald and Richard's movements, knew that the moment of truth was quickly approaching. He had to be prepared for anything, as the secret he had kept for so long was about to be revealed. The investigation was in full swing, and Ronald Anderson could think of nothing else. The mystery surrounding Helen consumed him completely, and he knew he wouldn't be able to rest until he discovered the truth. In the days following his conversation with Richard, he began to observe Helen more closely, looking for clues in her behavior, her gestures, and even in her physical traits, any evidence that could confirm his suspicions. Meanwhile, Helen carried on with her duties at the mansion, unaware that she was the subject of a thorough investigation. She noticed the changes in Ronald's behavior but attributed them to the fact that he was a busy man, dealing with business matters she could never understand. Her life was focused on her daily tasks, which she performed diligently, and on the garden, where she found peace. Ronald, always watchful, also noticed Ronald's growing closeness to Helen. His eyes followed every interaction, every exchange of words, and his heart clenched tighter each time. He knew that Ronald was trying to connect with Helen, and that could only mean one thing: the truth was dangerously close to being revealed, and he couldn't allow that to happen. That morning, Ronald decided it was time to take the next step in his approach to Helen. He was determined to learn more about the young woman, about her past, her experiences, her memories, everything that could help unravel the mystery surrounding her. He found her in the garden, as usual, busy tending to the plants. The sun was still low in the sky, and the morning dew sparkled on the petals of the flowers. "Good morning, Helen," he said, approaching her with a smile. Helen, who was concentrating on pruning a rose bush, quickly stood up when she heard the master's voice. "Good morning, Mr. Anderson," she responded, trying to hide her surprise at seeing him there so early. "I've always admired your work here in the garden," Ronald commented, looking around. "You've really transformed this place." Helen smiled timidly, proud of the recognition. "Thank you, sir. I really like taking care of the plants. They help me relax and think." "I understand," he said, putting his hands in his pockets. "It seems you have a natural talent for this. Has it always been like this? I mean, have you always liked gardens?" Helen hesitated for a moment, thinking about the question. "Not really, sir. I never had a real garden to care for until I came here. At the orphanage, there were some plants, but nothing compared to this place." Ronald felt a knot in his stomach when he heard the mention of the orphanage. He knew that was an important part of Helen's story, but at the same time, he feared what he might discover. "So, you grew up in an orphanage?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes, sir," Helen replied, lowering her gaze to the ground. "I was taken there when I was very young. I don't remember anything before that. The orphanage was all I knew until now." Ronald nodded slowly, absorbing Helen's words. "That must have been difficult for you," he commented softly, almost paternally. "It was hard sometimes," Helen admitted, not wanting to go into details. "But it was also the place where I learned a lot of things, where I met people who helped me become who I am today." Ronald watched her in silence for a moment, feeling a wave of compassion for this young woman who, despite all the hardships, had become such a strong and determined person. He knew he needed to keep gaining her trust while also trying to gather more clues about the necklace. "And that necklace," he said, discreetly gesturing toward the one Helen wore. "You said it's the only thing you have from your past. Do you have any idea where it came from?" Helen held the necklace delicately, feeling the cold metal between her fingers. "No, sir. They always told me I already had it when they found me. It's all I have from my past, so I've always taken good care of it." "I understand," Ronald said, disguising the emotion in his voice. "It's a beautiful necklace, and it seems very important to you." "Yes, it is," Helen replied, smiling softly. "I've always had the feeling that it has some special meaning, but I never knew what it was." Ronald knew he was getting closer to the moment of suggesting the DNA test, but he needed to do it in a way that wouldn't arouse suspicion. He decided that, for the moment, he would continue building her trust while gathering more information. That same afternoon, he called Richard for a discreet meeting in his office. When the detective arrived, Ronald recounted the conversation he had had with Helen and the need to delve deeper into the investigation. "Richard, I need you to keep digging. See if you can find anything in the orphanage records, any clue about how Helen got there, who left her there. We need more information before making any moves." "Understood, Mr. Anderson," Richard replied, noting down the instructions. "I'll do everything I can to find any detail that might help us." While the investigation continued, Helen remained under careful observation, not only by Ronald but also by Ronald, who was growing increasingly nervous. He knew that if Ronald kept getting closer to Helen, it would only be a matter of time before everything was revealed, and he couldn't allow that to happen. Days later, while doing her chores inside the mansion, Helen was surprised by Ronald, who approached her with a more serious expression than usual. "Helen, I need to speak with you," he said in a low, firm voice. Helen, who was cleaning a bookshelf, immediately stopped and turned toward him. "Yes, Mr. Ronald. What's going on?" Ronald observed her for a moment before continuing. "I've noticed that Mr. Anderson has been speaking to you a lot lately. That's unusual, considering his profile." Helen was surprised by the observation but tried to hide her unease. "He's been kind to me, sir. That's all." "I know," Ronald replied with a tone that indicated he knew more than he was saying. "I just want you to be careful, Helen. Sometimes, things in this house aren't what they seem." Helen frowned, confused. "What do you mean by that, Mr. Ronald?" Ronald hesitated, weighing whether he should reveal more or not, but he decided it was better to keep things vague for now. "Just be careful. Don't get too involved with Mr. Anderson. Remember, you're here to do your job, nothing more." Helen nodded, feeling a strange tension growing inside her. "I understand, Mr. Ronald. I'll keep that in mind." Ronald gave Helen one last look before leaving the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts. He knew he had to act quickly, but he still wasn't sure how to do it without raising suspicion. Meanwhile, Helen felt a growing sense of unease. The conversation with Ronald had unsettled her, but she couldn't fully understand why. The next day, Ronald decided it was time to involve Teresa, his wife, in the situation. He knew Teresa had the right to know what was happening, especially if there was a chance that Helen was indeed Emma. He found her in the living room, sitting and reading a book. "Teresa," he began, sitting next to her. "I need to talk to you about something very important." Teresa looked at him, immediately noticing the seriousness in his expression. "What's going on, Ronald? Has something happened?" He took a deep breath before continuing. "Do you remember the new maid we hired, Helen?" "Yes, of course. She seems like a nice girl," Teresa responded, curious to know where the conversation was going. "There's something about her, something that made me think of Emma," Ronald said, his voice trembling slightly as he mentioned their daughter's name. Teresa fell silent, her gaze fixed on her husband. "What do you mean, Ronald?" "Helen is wearing a necklace, Teresa. A necklace identical to the one Emma wore the day she disappeared." The book slipped from Teresa's hands, falling to the floor unnoticed. Her breathing quickened, and her eyes filled with tears. You think she could be? I don't know, Ronald replied, his voice filled with emotion. But I need to find out. Richard is investigating Helen's background, and I'm already trying to get closer to her to understand more. But if there's even the slightest possibility that Helen is our daughter, we need to do a DNA test. Teresa brought her hand to her mouth, trying to control the emotions that overwhelmed her. Ronald, this is so unexpected. I don't even know what to think. Neither do I, he admitted, taking her hand. But we need to be strong, Teresa. We need to do whatever it takes to discover the truth. If Helen is Emma, we'll have to face it together. And if she's not, we must be prepared for another disappointment. Teresa nodded slowly, trying to process everything. Then we'll do whatever it takes. If there's any chance that our daughter is alive, we need to find out. The following days were tense, with Ronald and Teresa trying to stay calm while they waited for Richard's findings and planned how to convince Helen to take the DNA test. Helen, on the other hand, continued to feel the increasing tension in the house, unaware that she was at the center of a mystery that would change her life forever. Finally, a week later, Richard returned to the mansion with new information. He was received immediately by Ronald and Teresa, who were anxious for updates. I have some updates, Richard said, handing a new envelope to Ronald. I managed to trace Helen's origin back to the orphanage where she was left. She was found in a park in Mexico City, as I mentioned before. But there's one detail that could be important. Ronald opened the envelope, pulling out the documents and examining them. What did you discover? Helen was left in the park by a man. A witness at the time said he was tall, wearing a dark coat, and seemed to be in a hurry. This matches some of the descriptions that emerged around the time of Emma's disappearance. Teresa squeezed Ronald's hand tightly. Does that mean there's a real possibility? Yes, Richard responded. But as we said before, the only way to be sure is with a DNA test, and that needs to be done soon, before Helen suspects anything. Ronald nodded decisively. We'll do it. Today. The next morning, the Anderson mansion was shrouded in palpable tension. Every member of the family and staff seemed to feel the weight of something undefined, a silent expectation that made the air heavier and more difficult to breathe. Ronald and Teresa woke up earlier than usual, both consumed by anxiety over discovering the truth about Helen. They knew that today could change their lives forever, but they also feared what that change might mean. Helen, for her part, started the day as usual, unaware of what was about to happen. After getting ready in her small room at the mansion, she went down to the kitchen, where Isabel was already preparing breakfast for the family. Isabel, always affectionate, noticed Helen's distracted expression and approached her. Good morning, Helen, Isabel said with a warm smile. You look thoughtful today. Is something bothering you? Helen returned the smile, but there was a glimmer of concern in her eyes. Good morning, Dona Isabel. I'm fine, just a little tired, I think. Isabel nodded, but she knew there was more behind that response. In the past few days, she had also noticed the increasing attention Ronald was paying to Helen, and it intrigued her. But Isabel was a woman of experience and knew better than to interfere, at least not yet. If you need to talk, I'm here, she said before returning to her work. While Helen helped in the kitchen, Ronald and Teresa were in the office, meeting with Richard to discuss the next steps. We need to approach Helen carefully, Richard said in a serious tone. We can't scare her or make her feel pressured. Ronald agreed, his expression grim. I know. We need to suggest the test in a way that doesn't make her suspicious. Maybe as part of a health check, something that seems natural. Teresa tried to stay calm as she added, we have to be sensitive. If she really is our daughter, I don't want our first shared memory to be one of fear or distrust. With the plan in place, Ronald asked Ronald to call Helen to the office. Ronald, who had been observing everything with growing tension, complied with the order, but his heart pounded in his chest. He knew time was running out. If Helen really was Emma, all his efforts to bury the truth would have been in vain, and more than that, he knew his position in the house and possibly even his freedom were at risk. As he walked through the mansion's corridors to call Helen, Ronald tried to think of a way to prevent the DNA test from taking place, but he couldn't find a solution that wouldn't raise immediate suspicions. He was trapped, cornered by his own secrets, and the only thing he could do now was watch and wait. Helen was in the garden, as always, tending to the plants when Ronald found her. He stopped for a moment, watching her in silence. There was something almost poetic about the way she moved among the flowers, as if she were in perfect harmony with the nature around her. But Ronald wasn't there to appreciate the beauty of the moment. "Helen," he called, his voice quieter than usual. She stood up quickly, turning toward him. "Yes, Mr. Ronald." "Mr. Anderson wants to speak with you in his office," he said, trying to maintain a neutral tone. Helen felt a knot forming in her stomach. "Right now?" "Yes, now," Ronald confirmed, avoiding her gaze. Helen sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. Something inside her told her this meeting would not be like the others. There was something in Ronald's voice, in the way he avoided looking her in the eye, that made her nervous. "All right, I'll go," she said, following Ronald into the mansion. As she walked through the corridors toward Ronald's office, Helen felt her throat tighten. She wondered if she had done something wrong. Was Mr. Anderson displeased with her work? When she arrived at the office door, she hesitated for a moment before knocking softly. Ronald's firm but gentle voice came from the other side, inviting her to enter. Helen opened the door and stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the expression on Ronald and Teresa's faces. There was something deeply emotional in their gazes, something Helen had never seen before. She felt a wave of unease, but she forced herself to walk to the front of the desk, where she stood, trying to keep calm. "Good evening, Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Teresa," Helen said, her voice slightly trembling. Ronald smiled at her, but it was a sad smile, as if he were about to bear the weight of the world in his words. "Good evening, Helen. Please, have a seat." Helen obeyed, sitting in the chair in front of them. Teresa, sitting beside Ronald, looked on the verge of tears, her hands clutching a handkerchief as her eyes remained fixed on Helen. The silence in the room was almost unbearable, and Helen felt the tension grow with each passing second. Ronald took a deep breath before starting to speak. "Helen, we have something very important to tell you, something that will change your life, but also ours." Helen's heart began to beat even faster. She swallowed hard, unable to hide the nervousness in her voice. "What is it, Mr. Anderson?" Ronald exchanged a glance with Teresa, as if seeking strength in her presence, then returned his gaze to Helen. "A few days ago, you agreed to take a health test for us. It included a DNA test as part of the process, and the results arrived today." Helen felt a pang of anxiety in her chest. Was there a problem? Am I sick?" "No, Helen," Teresa responded, her voice soft and full of emotion. "You're healthy. The test didn't reveal any health problems." Helen looked at the two of them, confused. "Then why am I here?" Ronald leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Helen's. "Because the DNA test revealed something we never expected, something that changed everything for us." Helen continued to look from Ronald to Teresa, seeking some explanation. "Helen," Teresa continued, unable to hold back the tears that finally began to fall down her face, "you are our daughter." The room seemed to spin around Helen, and for a moment she thought she might faint. Teresa's words echoed in her mind, but they made no sense. How could she be their daughter? It was impossible. She had always believed she had been abandoned as a baby, left behind by parents who didn't want her. The idea that she was actually the daughter of the Anderson family, one of the most powerful families in Mexico, was simply incomprehensible. "I don't understand," Helen whispered, her voice weak as her eyes darted between Ronald and Teresa, searching for answers. "I know it's hard to believe, Helen," Ronald said, his voice filled with pain, "but it's the truth. You are our daughter, Emma. You disappeared when you were just a child, and ever since then, we never stopped searching for you. And now, we've finally found you." Helen started shaking her head, trying to reject the information. "No, it can't be. I'm not Emma. I'm Helen. I've always been Helen." Teresa stood up from her chair and approached Helen, kneeling beside her. She gently held Helen's hands, looking into her eyes with an intensity Helen had never seen before. "You are Emma, dear. You've always been. We were deceived for so long, but now, thank God, you are back. We're here, and we've always been waiting for you." Tears began to stream down Helen's face as the overwhelming weight of the truth sank in. Everything she knew about herself seemed to crumble. Her identity, her life, all the certainties she had were ripped from her in an instant. But, how? How did this happen? Helen asked, her voice trembling as she sought an explanation. Ronald explained, his voice breaking with emotion, how Emma had been kidnapped as a child. He told her about the years of relentless searching, the leads that always led to dead ends, and how the necklace Helen wore had been the link that finally led them to her. "We didn't know what had happened to you," he said with trembling words, "until now. Until you appeared at our doorstep, not knowing who you really were." Helen felt as if she were drowning in a sea of emotions. It was as if the world was collapsing around her, and she had nothing solid to hold on to. This is too much," she murmured, pulling her hands away from Teresa's and standing up abruptly from her chair. Teresa, still kneeling on the floor, looked up at her with almost palpable desperation. "Helen, Emma, please, try to understand. We didn't want to scare you, but you needed to know. You are our daughter, and we love you more than anything in this world." Helen shook her head again, bringing her hands to her head as if trying to push away the information. "This can't be true. I'm not your daughter. I'm Helen. I'm Helen." Ronald also stood up, taking a step toward her. "I know it's hard to accept. I know it seems impossible, but we are here to help you. We don't want to force you into anything. We just want you to know the truth." Helen looked at them, tears freely running down her face. It was as if the room was closing in on her, and she felt an overwhelming need to escape. "I need to get out of here," she said, turning toward the door. "Helen, please, don't leave," Teresa implored, her voice breaking with sobs. "We need you here. We need time to explain everything." But Helen was already opening the door, desperation written all over her face. "I can't. I need to think. I need to get out." Ronald took another step toward her, but stopped, sensing that any sudden move might push her away even further. "All right, Helen," he said, his voice calm but heavy with emotion. "If you need time, we understand. But please, don't disappear. Stay here, where we can talk calmly." She nodded briefly but didn't say anything more. She rushed out of the office, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors of the mansion. The cold night air hit her as soon as she opened the front door and stepped into the garden. She collapsed onto one of the stone benches, gasping for breath. The sky above was clear, dotted with stars, but Helen couldn't see anything beyond the chaos in her mind. Her entire life had just been torn away from her. Her identity, everything she thought she knew, was now shattered. She curled up on the bench, feeling more alone than ever before. While Helen sat there, trying to process the devastating revelation, Ronald watched from a distance. He knew the truth had finally been exposed, and the panic inside him grew with every passing minute. He could no longer deny what he had done, and every step Helen took toward accepting the truth sealed his own fate. Inside the office, Teresa collapsed in tears in Ronald's arms. "She hates us, our own daughter hates us." "No, Teresa," Ronald said, though his words were meant to convince himself as much as to comfort her. She's confused. She's scared. We need to give her time to process all of this. She'll come back to us. I know she will. But even as he said the words, Ronald knew that nothing would be simple from this point forward. The reunion he had imagined for so long, the moment he would finally embrace his lost daughter, was turning into an even greater pain. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult for all of them. The truth had been revealed, but now came the hardest part, rebuilding what had been destroyed by so many years of separation. Meanwhile, outside, Helen remained curled up on the bench, struggling to make sense of everything. The stars shone indifferently above her, and the world around her seemed to continue as if nothing had changed. But inside her, everything was different. Her life, her identity, everything she thought she knew had been turned upside down, and now, she was alone, facing an uncertain future, unsure of whom to trust or what to do. The night dragged on slowly, but time seemed to have stopped for Helen. She remained seated in the garden, lost in her thoughts. The air was cold, and the night breeze carried with it the scent of the flowers she had so lovingly tended in recent weeks. But the garden that once was her refuge now felt like a prison, a place that symbolized everything she thought she was but now realized was a lie. Ronald and Teresa were also wide awake inside the mansion, too anxious to sleep. They could hardly stop thinking about Helen, worrying about how to handle the situation and how to help her accept the truth. Teresa, who was pacing back and forth in the living room, turned to Ronald. What if she never accepts us? What if she hates us forever? Ronald, trying to be calm for both of them, said, she just needs time, Teresa. We have to be patient. She's been through something unimaginable. But I believe she'll come around. We can't lose faith. After a while, Teresa couldn't bear being inside the house anymore, surrounded by memories and uncertainty. I need to see her, she said abruptly, standing up. I need to talk to Helen. Ronald looked at her with concern. Are you sure? Maybe we should wait until tomorrow, give her some time to process everything. I can't wait, Ronald. I can't just sit here imagining what she must be feeling. I need to be with her, show her we're here, that we love her. Ronald knew he couldn't stop her. Teresa had always been a loving and protective mother, and now, with Helen, back in her life, that need to protect her daughter was overwhelming. All right, he said softly. I'll come with you. They left the mansion together, heading for the garden. The night was dark, illuminated only by the light of the stars and the soft glow of the moon. They found Helen sitting on one of the stone benches, curled up on herself. Teresa's heart broke at the sight of her daughter looking so alone and vulnerable. Without saying a word, she slowly approached, as if afraid any sudden movement might scare her away. Helen, Teresa called softly, her voice full of concern. Helen lifted her head, and when she saw Teresa approaching, a new wave of emotions washed over her. She didn't know how to react. Part of her heart wanted to believe what these people were saying, that they were her parents and that she had finally found her family. But another part of her, the part that had been hardened by the pain of abandonment and the reality of growing up alone, screamed that it wasn't possible. Teresa knelt beside Helen, gently holding her hands. I know this is scary, she said, her voice trembling. But I want you to know that we're here for you. We've always been here for you, and we always will be. Helen tried to pull her hands away, but emotional exhaustion made it impossible. I don't know what to think. This is too much for me. I know, Teresa said, tears filling her eyes. I know it's overwhelming, and I don't expect you to understand it all right away. I just want you to know that what we feel for you is real. You are our daughter, Emma, and we love you more than anything in this world. Helen looked at Teresa, trying to find a hint of deception in her words, but all she saw was genuine pain and love. It made her feel even more conflicted. But I'm Helen. I'm Helen, she whispered, almost as if trying to convince herself that everything was still the same. You are Helen, Ronald said, his voice calm but full of emotion. But you're also Emma. That doesn't change who you are. What we want is for you to know the truth, and to feel that you have a safe place here with us. Helen took a deep breath, feeling her mind racing. What does this mean for me? Everything I knew, everything I thought was true, what happens now? Teresa squeezed Helen's hands a little tighter. Now, it means you have a family that loves you, that always has. We know we can't change the past, but we can build a future together. A future where you'll never feel alone again. Teresa's words struck something deep inside Helen. The desire to belong, to have a family, had always been buried in her heart, but she had repressed it for so long, fearing the pain of rejection. Now, standing before these people who said they were her parents, she didn't know if she could allow herself to believe it, if she could risk being hurt again. Before she could respond, the three were interrupted by the arrival of Ronald, who had been watching the scene from afar and had finally decided to approach. His face was pale, and there was a look of desperation in his eyes. Mr. Anderson, Ronald said in a voice lower than usual, I need to speak with you. It's urgent. Ronald frowned, surprised by the interruption. Ronald, now is not the time. But it's precisely about this that I need to speak, Ronald insisted, his eyes pleading for a chance to speak in private. Please, sir, just a moment. Ronald hesitated but saw the seriousness in Ronald's face. All right. Teresa, stay with Helen. I'll be right back. Teresa nodded as Ronald walked away with Ronald to a more secluded corner of the garden. Ronald looked around, making sure no one else could hear them before speaking in a hushed but urgent tone. Mr. Anderson, there's something I need to confess, something I should have said a long time ago. Ronald felt a chill run down his spine. What are you talking about, Ronald? What do you mean? Ronald took a deep breath, gathering all the courage he had left. It's about Helen, Emma. A long time ago, it was me. I was the one who left her in that park. I was the one responsible for her disappearance. Ronald felt like he had been punched in the stomach. He stood frozen, unable to believe what he was hearing. You did what? His voice trembled with a growing rage. Ronald hung his head, unable to meet Ronald's eyes. I was afraid. Afraid of losing my position in the house. When Emma was born, there were rumors that you were bringing in a new butler, someone younger, more capable. I knew if that happened, I would be finished. So I made a terrible decision, one I've regretted every day since. Ronald could feel his anger boiling over. You kidnapped my daughter. You abandoned her in a park and left her to die, all for a job. Ronald was trembling, tears now rolling down his face. I didn't want her to die. I thought someone would find her, that she would be taken somewhere safe. But I never imagined she would end up in an orphanage, growing up without knowing who she really was. I'm a monster, Mr. Anderson, and I deserve any punishment you decide to give me. Ronald was beyond shocked. The revelation from Ronald poured salt into wounds that had never healed. He felt betrayed, hurt, and furious, but at the same time, part of him was frozen, unable to process that the man who had been by his side for so many years, the man he had trusted, was responsible for the greatest pain he had ever known. With his voice shaking with rage, Ronald took a step toward Ronald, fists clenched. You destroyed my family, he said, each word laced with venom. You made me believe that my daughter was dead, that I would never see her again, and for what? For a job. Ronald was sobbing now, fully aware that there were no excuses for what he had done. Ronald's anger was completely justified. He was ready to accept whatever fate awaited him, even if it meant the end of his life as he knew it. Before Ronald could act, Teresa and Helen approached, drawn by the raised voices. Teresa's face was full of worry as she looked between her husband and Ronald. Ronald, what's happening? Teresa asked, her eyes flicking between the two men. Helen, who had remained quiet beside Teresa, felt her heart race. Something was terribly wrong, and she could tell immediately. "Why are you arguing?" she asked, her voice trembling. Ronald looked at Helen, his anger turning into deep pain. How could he tell her what he had just discovered? How could he explain that the man she barely knew as the mansion's butler had been responsible for all the suffering she had endured? But before Ronald could respond, Ronald, in a desperate act, dropped to his knees at Helen's feet, grabbing her hands with a grip that was both pleading and frantic. "Helen, Emma, please, forgive me," he begged, tears falling freely onto the grass around them. "I was the one responsible for your disappearance. I left you in that park all those years ago, and not a day has passed that I haven't regretted it. I'm a terrible man, and nothing I say can justify what I did, but please, forgive me." Helen stood there frozen, unable to believe what she was hearing. The world seemed to spin around her as Ronald's words sank in. This man, the butler she barely knew, had been the cause of everything, her entire life of loneliness and abandonment. You did this to me." Helen began to speak, but her voice faltered. "How? Why? How could you?" Ronald was sobbing uncontrollably, unable to lift himself from the ground. "I was a coward, Emma. I was terrified, and I acted in the worst possible way. I know nothing I say can make up for what I did, but I'm ready to face any punishment you think is fair. Even if I'm punished, it will never be enough to fix the damage I've caused." Ronald, unable to bear seeing Ronald groveling at Helen's feet, grabbed him by the shoulders and pulled him to his feet, holding him firmly. "You're going to pay for what you did," he said, his voice seething with hatred. "I'll make sure you face justice for all of this, and I'm starting right now." Ronald didn't resist. He knew his fate was sealed. Ronald signaled one of the mansion's guards, who quickly approached. "Take him inside and call the police," Ronald ordered. "He's going to confess everything he's done." The guard obeyed, grabbing Ronald by the arms and leading him back into the mansion. Ronald, defeated and without the strength to resist, followed in silence, knowing that his end was near. Helen watched it all in a state of shock. This man, who had barely been part of her life, had destroyed everything, and now he was being taken away to face the consequences of his actions. But even as she watched him go, she felt no relief, only a growing emptiness, a pain that she didn't know how to begin to heal. Teresa, who had stood beside her the whole time, finally embraced Helen tightly, trying to offer her some comfort. "He will pay for what he's done, dear," she whispered through her own tears, "but we're here now. We'll get through this together." Helen, still in shock, allowed Teresa to hold her, but deep down, she knew it would take a long time to process everything she had learned that night. Most of all, she knew that her life was about to change dramatically. The next morning dawned gray, as if reflecting the tension and weight that now hung over the Anderson mansion. The news of Ronald's arrest had spread quickly among the staff, creating an atmosphere of whispers and suspicious glances. Everyone was aware that something terrible had happened, but no one dared ask directly what it was. Suspicions ran wild, but only a few knew the full truth about the events of the previous night. Ronald and Teresa, exhausted both physically and emotionally, had barely slept. The weight of Ronald's confession and the impact it had on Helen had kept them up, tossing and turning in bed, struggling with waves of guilt and worry that crashed over them. When they finally rose early in the morning, there was a silent understanding between them. They needed to take care of Helen, to help her recover from the trauma, and most importantly, to make sure she knew she now had a family who loved her. Helen, on the other hand, was lost. Since the moment Teresa had hugged her in the garden, she had felt an internal collapse. Everything she had known about herself had been stripped away in a matter of hours, and the revelation that Ronald, the man who had served the Anderson family for so many years, was responsible for her disappearance only made things more confusing and painful. How should she react to this? How could she possibly heal from something so deep and devastating? Unlike Ronald and Teresa, Helen spent the night wide awake, sitting in her small room, staring blankly into the darkness. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fragmented memories, conflicting feelings, and a pain so intense it felt like it was crushing her chest. She knew she had to face this new reality, but she was terrified of what it would mean. Early in the morning, Isabel, always attentive, noticed that Helen had not come out of her room. Normally, Helen would already be in the garden, tending to the plants, but that day, the garden was empty. Concerned, Isabel went to Helen's room, gently knocking on the door before entering. "Helen." Isabel called softly as she opened the door. "Are you all right, dear?" Helen was sitting on the edge of her bed, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. When Isabel entered, Helen barely lifted her gaze, not fully registering the older woman's presence. "I don't know, Dona Isabel," Helen replied, her voice weak and exhausted. "I don't know if I'll ever be all right again." Isabel, who had always been a maternal figure to everyone in the mansion, felt her heart tighten at the sight of Helen's state. She approached and sat next to the young woman, taking Helen's hands in hers with gentle care. "I can't imagine the pain you're feeling right now, dear," Isabel said, her voice warm and compassionate. "But you are strong. You've always been strong, and I know you'll get through this." Helen let out a shaky sigh, feeling fresh tears threatening to spill. How can I get through this, Dona Isabel? Everything I thought I knew, everything I believed was real, it's nothing. I don't even know who I am." Isabel stroked Helen's hands, offering the only comfort she could. "I don't know how you feel, dear. But I do know one thing, you are so much more than your past. Whatever happened to you doesn't define who you are. You are a wonderful, hardworking, kind person. And most of all, you are loved. That hasn't changed." Helen looked up at Isabel, the tears finally falling again. "But what if I can't be that person? What if I can't fit into this new world they've presented me?" Isabel smiled softly, her eyes full of tenderness. "You don't need to fit into anything, Helen. You just need to be yourself. The Anderson family is here to help you discover who you are, to support you, and I will be here too, whenever you need me." Isabel's words brought Helen a small measure of comfort. She knew she would need all the support she could get in the days to come. "Thank you, Dona Isabel," Helen whispered, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her pajama top. "I don't know what I would do without you." "You don't need to know that," Isabel replied with a kind smile. "Now, why don't you take a bath and get ready? I know Mr. and Mrs. Anderson are worried about you and want to see you." Helen nodded slowly, knowing that she couldn't put off the inevitable conversation with her biological parents for much longer. Isabel left the room, giving her space to prepare herself. When Helen finally rose and entered the bathroom, every movement felt like an immense effort, as if her body resisted the reality waiting for her outside the door. Meanwhile, Ronald and Teresa were waiting anxiously in the living room, their hands clasped together in an automatic gesture of mutual support. Teresa, unable to hide her anxiety, was pacing back and forth, her heart heavy with fear. "What if she doesn't want to see us, Ronald? What if she rejects us forever?" Teresa's voice trembled with worry. Ronald, despite his own fears, tried to remain calm for Teresa's sake. "We have to give her time, Teresa. Helen, or Emma, has gone through an immense trauma, and it's going to take time for her to process everything. But I believe she will give us a chance." Teresa stopped and looked at her husband, her eyes brimming with tears. "I just want to hug her, Ronald. I want to tell her how much we love her, how much we've missed her. But I'm so afraid it's too late." "It's not too late," Ronald said firmly. "It can't be. We have to believe that." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they heard soft footsteps descending the stairs. Teresa was the first to rise, her heart pounding in her chest. When Helen appeared at the end of the hallway, Teresa rushed toward her, but stopped a few steps away, hesitating as if she didn't want to scare her. Helen was dressed simply, her face still marked by sadness, her eyes tired as she looked at Teresa and Ronald. For a moment, the three stood in silence, simply looking at each other. Ronald also stood, moving a little behind Teresa, unsure of how to begin. Helen, Teresa began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, I know you're going through something very difficult, but we're here for you. We want you to know that we're ready to support you in whatever you need. Helen felt a lump in her throat and, for a moment, thought she wouldn't be able to speak. I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice breaking. Everything is so unreal. I don't even know how to make sense of it all. I know, Ronald said, stepping forward and speaking in a calm, understanding tone. And we understand that you need time. We're not asking you to accept us immediately. We just want you to know that we're here for you, that we always will be. This is your home, and you have a family who loves you. His words were sincere, but Helen felt an internal barrier, something that kept her from fully accepting what they were saying. I need time to figure it all out, she said, her voice filled with confusion and pain. It's hard to believe that all of a sudden, I have a family, that everything I knew wasn't real. You don't have to understand it all at once, Teresa said, her voice filled with emotion. We just want you to know that we're here, and you don't have to face this alone. Helen nodded slowly, knowing that she needed time to herself to process everything that had happened. She took a deep breath before speaking again. I think I need to go out for a while, she said hesitantly. I need to think. Teresa and Ronald exchanged worried glances, but they knew they couldn't force Helen to stay. Of course, Ronald said, nodding in understanding. We can arrange for a car to take you wherever you'd like. Thank you, Helen said, grateful that they weren't pressuring her. I just need some time to myself. As Helen prepared to leave, Ronald made sure to call the family driver, giving him clear instructions to take Helen wherever she needed and to ensure her safety. Teresa, though still worried, understood that Helen needed space and that trying to hold her back in the mansion against her will would only make things worse. When Helen finally stepped out into the back seat of the car, she looked out at the city as it passed by, through streets that had become so familiar. She didn't know where she was going, she just knew she needed to escape everything, even if only for a brief time. The driver took her to a quiet park, where Helen got out of the car and started walking, feeling the soft ground beneath her feet and the gentle sound of water lapping against the shores of the nearby lake. The park was nearly empty, which was a relief for Helen. She needed silence, solitude, to process her thoughts. As she walked, memories of the orphanage began to flood her mind. Though she didn't have many clear memories of her childhood, fragments of her life there constantly surfaced, bringing with them mixed emotions. There had been moments of pain, loneliness, and abandonment, but there were also memories of friendship, of camaraderie with other children who, like her, had been left behind. Thinking about it all left her even more confused. How could she reconcile these two versions of her life? How could she be both Helen and Emma? She sat down on a wooden bench by the lake, watching as small waves formed on the water. The reflections of the gray sky mirrored her clouded mind. Helen knew that Ronald and Teresa loved her, that they were doing everything possible to make her feel at home. But the fear of not being able to return that love, of not being able to reconnect with them, paralyzed her. Helen sat there for what felt like hours, lost in her thoughts. The park was quiet, the wind gently moving the leaves, the sound of water lapping at the shore soothing but distant. It was as though the world outside moved on, indifferent to the turmoil within her. How could she move forward? How could she accept the truth that she was Emma, the daughter of the Anderson family? And yet, how could she deny the life she had lived as Helen, the only life she had ever known? Both identities felt real, but they also felt at odds, pulling her in different directions. But then something shifted within her. Helen realized that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to choose. Maybe she could be both Helen and Emma, without losing either part of herself. Helen was the strong girl who had survived the orphanage, who had endured years of loneliness, who had learned to fend for herself. And Emma. Emma was the daughter who had been deeply loved, who had been lost but never forgotten, who was now given a chance to reconnect with the family that had spent so long searching for her. The thought brought her a small, tentative sense of peace. She didn't need to let go of who she was, she just needed to find a way to reconcile her past with her future. Helen, no, Emma, stood up from the bench, taking a deep breath. The air felt different now, less heavy, as if she had released some of the weight that had been pressing down on her. She knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt like she could take the first steps. She returned to the car and asked the driver to take her back to the mansion. When she arrived, the mansion felt less like a place of shadows and secrets and more like a home she could one day accept as her own. Ronald and Teresa were waiting for her in the living room, their expressions tense but hopeful. "I'm ready to talk," Emma said softly, stepping into the room. Both of her parents visibly relaxed, though they approached her cautiously, not wanting to overwhelm her. Teresa was the first to speak. "We're so glad you've come back," she said, her voice filled with warmth and relief. "We've been worried, but we understand if you need more time." Emma shook her head. "I think I'll always need time," she admitted, her voice steady but emotional. "But I want to try. I want to be part of this family. I need you to understand that I can't forget the life I've lived as Helen. She's part of me too." Ronald stepped forward, his eyes filled with pride and love. "You don't have to forget anything," he said, his voice strong yet gentle. "Helen made you who you are. And we love you for all of it, for Helen and for Emma." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she looked at her parents, her real parents, for the first time without the cloud of doubt and confusion hanging over her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Teresa couldn't hold back any longer. She rushed to Emma, pulling her into a tight embrace, one full of all the love and emotion she had held inside for years. Emma, for the first time, allowed herself to fully accept it, wrapping her arms around her mother and holding on as though she might never let go. Ronald joined them, placing a hand on his daughter's back, and together they stood in the quiet, sharing a moment that they had long believed would never come. For the next few weeks, life at the mansion began to shift. Emma slowly opened herself up to the idea of belonging to the Anderson family. She started spending more time with her parents, sharing stories of her life as Helen and listening to their memories of her early years as Emma. It wasn't easy, there were still moments when she felt lost, overwhelmed by the weight of both her identities, but she knew she wasn't alone in her journey. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, Emma sat with Teresa on the stone bench near the roses she had been tending for weeks. The garden had always been her refuge, but now it felt like a place of connection, a bridge between the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming. "I think I'm finally starting to understand," Emma said quietly, her eyes on the flowers. Teresa looked at her daughter, her heart full. "What do you understand, dear?" Emma turned to her with a small, peaceful smile. "That I don't have to be just one or the other. I can be both Helen and Emma. And I can be loved for all of it." Teresa reached out and gently touched her daughter's hand. "You are loved, Emma. Every part of you. We're just so happy that you're home." Emma nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over her that she hadn't felt in a long time. The road ahead would still be difficult, there would be more to reconcile, more healing to be done, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. As the evening deepened and the stars began to appear in the sky, Emma sat with her mother, knowing that she had finally found her place. It wasn't just in the mansion, or in the family she had rediscovered. It was in herself, in the acceptance of who she was, both Helen and Emma, a girl who had been lost but had now, at last, come home.